I have, by my own calculations, been a preacher, both student and ordained, for 23 Advent and Christmas seasons. That means that over 23 Advent and Christmas seasons I have preached on the passages in the Bible that talk about the Christmas story. And yet in all that time, I have never, not even once, preached on two passages that are a key part of that Christmas story, indeed an essential part of that story. Now, of course, you realize that we have two accounts of the birth of Jesus that have come down to us in the Bible. Two of the Gospels, Matthew and John, didn't worry about the story of Jesus' birth. They started with an account of him being baptized by John as a young man. Only Matthew and Luke felt the need to go back and find the story of Jesus' origins and tell that story to us. And both of them seem to have independently decided that it was essential, in order for them to do that, to give an account of Jesus' family tree. They felt it was that important that they were willing to spend precious ink, precious parchment, and precious time doing it. They thought it was essential to the story. And yet in 23 years, I've never so much as read those accounts in public, and I have never preached on them. Now you can probably guess one good reason why I have not preached on these passages. You probably guessed it within seconds of us beginning to read those passages today. I didn't want to read them. I didn't want to make a worship assistant or lay reader read them either. Though I must admit, it was kind of fun to make Randy do it today. But my concern was not only that I was afraid I might sprain my tongue. I basically bought into the assumption that we all make as we read those passages. That they are dull, that they are boring, that they don't really matter. And it's better to skip them over and rush straight to those dramatic and exciting parts of the Christmas story. This is a mistake. These passages are important. They are essential. They are more important, in fact, to a correct understanding of the story of Christmas than all of the angels and shepherds and wise men combined. The gospel writers saw it that way. And so this year I decided to suck it up and actually preach on the genealogies. When you look at the genealogies, there are a couple of things that stand out to you immediately. First, you have to sort them out, of course. Because the first thing you recognize is that the two gospel writers tell the story of the family tree of Jesus in opposite directions. Luke starts with Jesus and works back in time. Matthew starts with Abraham and works forward in time. But once you sorted that out and flipped them around, you notice a few things. First thing you notice is that both of these authors are saying very clearly that Jesus is descended from King David. This was very important to them. It was part of the basic Christian claim that Jesus was the Messiah. So, of course, they included David among Jesus' ancestors. The second thing you notice, though, is this. Though they both connect Joseph and David, they do so through different sets of ancestors. The lists just don't match. Can you imagine if you went on Ancestry.com and you got a family tree, a printout of your family tree, and then you went to your great Uncle Bill, who for 20 years has been working independently on the family tree, and you got his account of your family tree, and you laid those two accounts side by side, and not one name matched. What would you think? You would assume either that Uncle Bill is out to lunch, or Ancestry.com is totally wrong, or maybe both. That's the situation we have when we compare the genealogy in Matthew to the genealogy in Luke. And people have known this forever. I mean, ever since the first Christian read Matthew and then read Luke, people have known that these two genealogies do not match. And so for almost 2,000 years, people have been trying to explain that. What's going on here? And a number of explanations have been put forward, of course. Perhaps the most popular explanation that you might hear. Some people will argue, well, what we have is Matthew is giving the genealogy of Joseph, and Luke is giving the genealogy of Mary. That's why they don't match. They're two different family stories. You may have heard that explanation before. It's been around for about 500 years. I am sorry to say, however, that that explanation simply does not hold any water. Nobody who knows anything about ancient societies accepts that explanation today. It simply didn't work that way. Ancient Jewish societies always traced ancestry through the male line. In this, as in many other things, unfortunately, women simply didn't count to that. So there's absolutely no scenario in which a first century person could possibly read Luke's account of Jesus' genealogy and understand that he is giving the genealogy of Mary. It's just not possible. And anyways, by the way, Luke doesn't even think that Mary is descended from King David, because he says that Mary is a close relative to Elizabeth. Elizabeth belongs to the tribe of Levi, not the tribe of Judah that King David comes from. So there's no way that Luke thinks that Mary is a descendant of King David. Basically, in about 2,000 years of biblical interpretation, nobody has ever come up with a way of explaining away the contradiction between these two lists. So we're basically left with one conclusion. Either one or both of these gospel writers felt that there was something more important than getting an accurate family tree of Jesus and putting in his gospel. See, you need to understand who wrote these gospels. The people who wrote these gospels were not journalists. They were not historians. They were gospel writers. And their job, as far as they were concerned, was to proclaim the truth about Jesus, who Jesus was, what he had come to do, what he represented. Their job was not simply to present the facts as they had happened. And sometimes the facts as they had happened, well, they may not have had them all, sometimes those facts got in the way of presenting the truth about Jesus as clearly as possible. When that happened, they didn't hesitate to adjust the facts so that they more clearly proclaimed the truth. This was quite normal in the ancient world. So if you really want to figure out what's going on with these two very different lists of the genealogy of Jesus, what you need to do is try and understand what these gospel writers are trying to accomplish by giving these lists. You have to look into the meaning of the lists and not obsess about individual names that just don't match up. So what are the gospel writers trying to do? First of all, let's look at Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. We actually know exactly where Matthew got much of this text, because the names that he gives after David, he is taken directly from the Old Testament. You can find those names, if you're looking at Greek translations, in the first book of Chronicles. Basically, Matthew has taken those names and copied them into his gospel. Because what you have there is a list of all of the people who reigned in Jerusalem following King David. What Matthew is giving us is the names of the Davidic dynasty that ruled in Jerusalem. And by saying that, by naming these names from the Old Testament in Jesus' genealogy, what Matthew is saying is this: Jesus is not just the heir of King David. He is the heir of the entire royal dynasty. He is setting us up to think of Jesus right from the beginning as the king, the one who has come to restore the ancient kingdom and its glories. If that's what Matthew's trying to do, what is Luke trying to do? Well, we don't know where Luke got all of his names, because we don't recognize any of them. They don't come from the Old Testament. They are, in fact, just ordinary Hebrew names. They refer to ordinary Hebrew men. Matthew didn't get them from the Old Testament because none of them were important enough to be named in the Old Testament. Where Luke got the list from, I don't know. I mean, it's possible, it's not impossible anyways, that Joseph's family may have had some kind of oral tradition where they passed down the names of their forefathers from generation to generation. Maybe Luke could have gotten access to such a list. But the point is, what's important to Luke is not where those names come from, but what they mean. With this list, basically what Luke is saying is that Joseph's family is just an ordinary Jewish family in the first century. Yes, they may have one rather important, illustrious ancestor, King David, but only one. After David, they're just an ordinary Jewish family, living as ordinary Jewish families do, or did. And that tells us a lot about the family that Luke is trying to describe. If they were just an ordinary Jewish family who happened to have one great ancestor, how were they supposed to live? Well, according to the laws of the Old Testament, every Jewish family was given by God a piece of land, a farm. And every Jewish family was supposed to keep that farm forever and pass it down to their children and their children's children and their children's children. They could not sell that land permanently. It was against the law. They could not lose that land because of debts permanently. It was God's will, it's all laid out in the books of Moses, it was God's will that they keep that land forever, that they live on it, that they eat the grain and the olive oil and the wine and the figs that it produced forever. That, the Bible says, is how it's supposed to work. That's the family that Joseph comes from. But if that is the family that Joseph comes from, we have a problem as the gospel opens, don't we? For when Joseph is introduced into the story, is he living on that piece of land that he inherited from his family? No, he is not. The piece of land would have been in Bethlehem. It would have been the piece of land that David had inherited from his father, that he had inherited from his grandfather, Boaz. But Joseph's not living in Bethlehem on that land. As the story opens, Joseph's living in Nazareth, in Galilee, a whole world away, as far as traveling times work in that world. This immediately marks Joseph as a man with a problem. It means that Joseph is someone who has lost the inheritance of his family. He's lost his land. This happened quite often in the first century. Because of high Roman taxes, because of the political system, because of debts, people all over places were losing the farms that had been in their family for generations. And so as Luke introduces Joseph, he introduces him as one such person. Somebody who's lost everything. Someone who is destitute. Now that's something that might confuse us a bit. Because of course we have always been taught that Joseph was a carpenter, right? And in our minds, a carpenter is a skilled artisan, a business person, someone who's able to turn a healthy profit from his craft. That's how we think of carpenters. Well, in first century Palestine, that's not what a carpenter was. In first century Palestine, a carpenter was a peasant who had lost his land, who had lost his family inheritance, and was basically living as landless and without permanent home. A carpenter was someone who had one small advantage, though. He had a few simple tools and the skills to use them. This allowed him to hire himself out as a day laborer on construction sites, and maybe to do odd jobs in the village. This maybe made a carpenter a little better off than an agricultural day laborer or a slave, but not much. It was an agricultural society, and everyone needed land, it was believed, in order to live and to prosper. A carpenter was someone who had no land, was therefore desperate and destitute. What Luke is saying is that those are the people that Joseph came from. People who lost everything. He is saying that Jesus comes from people like that. People who've lost everything. It's no wonder, really, that Jesus then grew up to be that person who went out and proclaimed in the world that such a system was wrong, that the poor and destitute were blessed, that the hungry would be filled with good things, that he went on to say that it was easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to be part of the kingdom of God. Jesus was speaking as one of these destitute people. He was speaking to destitute people. And he was giving them hope. So basically, by giving this genealogy at the beginning of his gospel, what Luke is doing for us is he's giving us fair warning. He's telling us this is the story he's going to tell. The story of a Jesus who comes from ordinary Hebrew people who, yes, happen to have one illustrious ancestor. But ordinary Hebrew people who have lost everything. With this genealogy, Jesus sets the tone for the whole story. It also, for me, raises a very dramatic and interesting possibility. For this is how Luke introduces the Christmas story. He says this, "And Joseph also went up from Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the city of David, because he was from the line of David." So Luke begins his story of the birth of Jesus by telling us that Joseph is heading to the place where his family comes from. The place where, according to the ancient laws of God, he's supposed to have some land. Land that belonged to his family. Land that rightfully now belongs to him. But he doesn't have that land anymore. When he arrives, he has no place to stay. And that leads me to wonder, what's going through Joseph's mind as he heads out on that journey? Is he going back to claim what he believes is his, what God says is his? Because honestly, the idea that he's going simply because it's part of the census doesn't make any sense. The Romans would not want to count Joseph in a place where he doesn't live, where they can't go back and find him to charge him for taxes later. The traveling doesn't really work as part of the census, but it does work if Joseph is going to claim what's rightfully his. And that's a possibility that I want to explore over the next few weeks. Please take a few moments in silent thought.